Can we do the ceremonial clap for editing?
Yeah.
So, today we are returning to the roots of this channel to bring you history on a plate. And today we are going to do that in the form of baker's dozen cinnamon rolls. Now your ordinary non-baker's dozen is the number 12, whereas a baker's dozen is actually the number 13. Now this comes to us from medieval England, where bakers were mandated by the state that they had to bake and sell evenly sized and weighted loaves of bread. Now, in order to avoid violence either from the mob in your village or even from the state, bakers used to bake 13 loaves of bread so that they could always take out the worst one and sell the 12 most uniform one. Now, that is the historical reason that people call these the baker's dozen, whereas today we are doing the complete opposite of the spectrum and doing cinnamon rolls that are so delicious that it becomes almost physiologically impossible not to eat one directly out of the oven. So if you want to give 12 of these to your guest, you have to make at least 13 in order to have 12 to serve. I'm going to, for the sake of scientific research, I'm going to show you. And I've been watching these for too long not to try to eat one myself. So I'm going to grab this. They should fall apart just such. And this is how they should come apart. You should have firm golden brown bottom, and they should fall apart when you tear at them.
I think that's a wrap.
We are going to use only 7 ingredients, and unlike with things like pizza and bread or just about everything else, we have to get fairly specific ingredients and we have to measure them almost exactly to the gram, and how we assemble them is almost as important, if not more important, than the ingredients that we use. 1 cube, or size of your choice, of yeast. Now, yeast is a microscopic mushroom-type singular organism which has been around for an almost incomprehensibly long time. Yeast is the thing that allowed human beings to make bread, wine, meat, beer, and just about everything that humans have been eating for as long as there have been humans. Yeast is also the thing that Louis Pasteur found, and is why we have the so-called Pasteur effect, which has nothing to do with cows or goats or whatever pasteurizing in a field. It is actually a 19th century Frenchman who discovered that if you heat things up and kill the yeast, you can keep food for much, much, much longer. And we will measure this with precisely 85 grams of brown sugar. Now you will notice, not quite immediately, but almost immediately, is that the sugar and the yeast will interact with each other. For this reason, bakers refer to sugar as a wet ingredient, even though you can touch it with your hand and you will see that it is obviously dry. Now, as you can see, after barely 1 or 2 minutes, the mixture has already started to turn liquid. So what you will need for this recipe is then 100 grams, and you will need butter from grass-fed cows, which I know is something that sounds very simple, but is actually very, very important because you have only 7 ingredients and you need them to all count. So I can only recommend this now, immediately and forever, that you use grass-fed butter and milk for this recipe, because the difference is subtle, but it does make all the difference. Now our butter has started to melt, which means it is time to put in precisely half a liter of milk, or 500 milliliters or 5 deciliters, however you choose to measure your liquids. Now this is actually quite important because, as I said, with most other things you can kind of just eyeball it or wing it, but the ratio and the exact measurements are of quite a big importance when making this recipe. Now is the time, so both in order to heat up your milk, but also to make sure that your butter does not burn, it is time to put in our milk. And you will need to get your milk up to around 30 to 40 degrees. And any less than that, and you just won't see anything activate. Now, because butter is quite thick and milk is less thick, you have to stir it or you will get them slightly layered with just the fat from the butter floating on top and the milk getting too warm. Now I have a thermometer, which is a lot more safe to use than my usual previous method of just burning my hands often enough that I know what to do, which is a terrible idea. So be smarter than me and use one of these, because they are both very handy and they give you the exact amount. Now that our milk and butter mixture has reached the desired temperature, that as I said, between 30 and 40 degrees. Again, if you heat your milk too hot, you will scald it, and secondly, you will kill the yeast. Now, even though we have done virtually nothing, you will see that the sugar and the yeast have gooified, to use the scientific term. Now, this goo and the wet mixture are now combined. For this part, you will have to stir somewhat thoroughly until the sugar more or less dissolves, which you will basically notice once you stop hearing this grinding sound of sugar against the spoon. You will know that you have dissolved your sugar. Bubbles forming, which means that our yeast is alive, but you have to keep stirring quite a lot, because as I said, you can see butter wants to form at the top, and so you have to keep stirring both that it doesn't get too warm, that the heat gets trapped under the butter, and we go until our sugar is dissolved, which should be now. Very important, add a bit of salt. It's very easy to over salt this, so make sure to not use too much or too salty a salt, but it's also critical not to forget. So even just like this is enough. Rule of thumb when it comes to sweet food, you would rather have them slightly undersalted than oversalted. But it is important, so please don't forget your salt. Now for this we will need 850 grams. Now traditionally people use an egg or two to bind the dough together, or they use full 1000 grams of flour. But we are going to use only 850, and we are going to mix them in very, very thoroughly. And then we will continue pouring around 100 grams at a time and stirring in as we go along. The reason that we do this slightly at a time is simply it's much easier to do 100 grams 8 times than it is to do the full 850 grams at once. Now if you look, you can see all sorts of bubbles forming in the dough already. And this is the importance of using fresh yeast. You can smell it already. It smells really good. And it's very difficult not to keep going. Now we do this 100, as I said, 100 grams at a time until roughly we have our 850. We are roughly halfway through, and this is starting to look more like a pancake batter or something like this. Now you will feel your dough starting to take shape. You can even watch it as it happens, and that's why it's so important to mix them in slowly and in parts, because otherwise you just don't get the same smooth texture, and it's very easy to overwork. We have to get very specific ingredients, and we have to measure them almost exactly to the gram. Now, if you watched my previous video on the history of pizza, where I said that pizza's simplicity and do-it-yourself attitude is that there's basically no wrong way to make pizza, and that's why pizza is so amazing. Whereas with this dough, I'm using a bench scraper so I don't get my hands constantly sticky, which I should have thought of, but I forgot because I was filming. But you can see that the dough is starting to come together. Now you just need to kind of throw it together, let the gluten build up, and you will notice, as if by magic, that this is almost precisely the amount that you need. Now, as I said, with pizza or bread or anything, you can just keep throwing flour until it sticks. But this, even if it's sticky, even if it feels like this can't possibly be the thing, is actually the thing. You just have to keep working at it. And then, as if by magic, it will become a thing. So, now when you work this, it's also important if you're making this for the first time, like I said, there's really no way to do this wrong. If you add a bit more flour, there's just more cinnamon rolls. There's really no concern about this. So if this looks too sticky, just remember that the butter and the milk, everything is slightly different. The humidity in the air, the dryness of your flour, etc., etc. But unlike with most bread doughs and things like this, here is about where we want to be. You can roll it, it should stick to your hand, but not get stuck on the paper. So once you have roughly this texture, you take your pen scraper, you throw it together, you make a small tiny bowl, or sorry, small ball rather. You take a bit of flour, dust it inside your bowl, you take your dough, you throw it in there, twirl it around until it is like this. Then you toss it over, fold it in, fold it in, fold it in, fold it in, turn it over, get the air out, toss it around once for good measure, and then you take one of these nice looking kitchen towels, you get it slightly warm. You need warm water so you keep the yeast alive and active, because the temperature in the dough is going to drop. So you take your wet, slightly warm washcloth, you wrap it around, you make sure that it touches the side, you tuck it under to keep the moisture in and external particles, etc. away, and then you touch it with your hand so that it makes a slight dent, and then once the dough has risen enough, you will see, because it will start pushing up against your washcloth, and that is the moment you know that you are ready for the next stage of baking. Now we will bake our cinnamon rolls, without exception, at 200 degrees. In an ideal world, we would have an oven with convection, which is the fancy word of using the oven fan. But if you don't have that option, like me, I have a gas oven, so I am going to put apples in the filling of my cinnamon rolls to keep the moisture in the dough, to make sure that they don't dry out, and because apples are delicious and apples and cinnamon go together like apples and cinnamon. Now for our filling, we will use the aforementioned grass-fed butter, cinnamon. Cinnamon, by the way, comes to us from the ancient Phoenician word cinnamomum, and cinnamomum, as well as the Latin scientific word cinnamomum verum, both mean nom nom nom. And cinnamon is, luckily enough, and what you probably already know, why these are called cinnamon rolls and not just rolls. Now this part of the recipe really is more of a personal preference / taste, and I can give you an exact ingredient amount, but certain people like them more sugary, some like them more buttery, some like them more cinnamony. So this really is the most personal part of the journey. You just have to make sure that you get enough sugar, using the same sugar as in the dough. It's, for me, is brown sugar. If you don't have brown sugar, you can substitute it with white sugar, but then you have to make sure that you use 100 grams of white sugar instead of 85, and you will have to use more white sugar for the filling as well. Now just keep stirring butter, sugar and cinnamon. I usually go by my nose, and once it smells the right amount of buttery, sugary and cinnamony, I know that I have my filling. Now this filling can be used for anything. You can use it in other types of baking. You can even just eat it. You can put it in the fridge, you can put it in the freezer. So always err on the side of caution, and you always want to be in a situation where you have too much filling rather than not enough, because you can always use less, whereas if you run out of filling, it's very hard to use. Yes, you want to make sure that you don't burn your sugar or your butter, but if you pre-melt the butter, you can also get a bit of that aforementioned nutty aroma, which some people like, but I prefer to have things slightly lower heat and more spreadable. Because I don't have a convection oven, I would have to go with the next best thing, which is a green apple. Now, green apples are sour and juicy, not to mention delicious, and for this reason are my preferred choice of apple. Now, you can use pretty much any apple, but I have found through repeated experiments that green apples work the best. This is a Granny Smith apple, and that is what I would recommend. I would recommend peeling the apple as well, because the texture of the skin leaves a slightly immersion breaking experience from the melt in your mouth experience that these cinnamon rolls are supposed to bring you. And so taking off the skin is really the best way to do this. Don't be like me and forget your stuff on the stove. Just stir it, like I said, keep adding sugar, butter and cinnamon until you get the amount of filling that you want. Like I said, some people like more filling, some people like less filling. You just have to make this recipe a few times and figure out which one works for you. Now we take our apples, and it doesn't really matter what size you go with as long as it is fairly uniform, so that each bite has the same similar experience, and so that you don't have partially uncooked apple and then overcooked apple. So there's no correct or wrong size. Just try to make sure that they are as uniform as possible. And like I said, for both structural issues in terms of the dough, but also the aroma and the complementary flavor, I would always recommend a sour green apple. I've tried everything else. Most consistently, sour green apples work the best. And as I said, and like saying, apples and cinnamon go together like apples and cinnamon. And you can also use a slightly bigger board than me, so that you have enough place for all of your apples, but such is the life in the kitchen. Not everything goes to plan. We just take what we have in front of us, adapt, and like I said, uniformity in size is more important than picking the right size. One more thing actually. Now that we have our oven on, you can do like me. If you are impatient, you can stick your dough on top of the oven as it is heating up, and this will speed up the yeast process, keeping your dough nice and warm. If you are in a hurry, or if you live in a cold place, you can even do this. You can toss it in the oven for half a minute at most, just taking off in between. And if you find that it is taking too slow to rise, just toss it in the oven for 20-30 seconds at a time, and this will speed up your process. Just be sure that you don't leave it in for too long, because then it will start baking and form a crust, which we only want to happen in the end. Now, this is what it looks like now after just a few minutes of kneading and rising, and it will need to be roughly here when we reach the next step in this baking process. Now, like I said, these things are very dependent on where you live in the world. So if you live somewhere cold and dry, this is going to take longer. If you live somewhere very warm and humid, this is going to take shorter. So I will again show you the texture of the dough. If it's still like this, if it's slightly clunky, if it feels dense, it means it's not risen enough. So we will return to this when it is good to go. Ceremonial editing clap for audio synchronization. So, like I said, I was a bit impatient, and these are good. So ideally, let them rise. If not, just leave them on top of the oven. Now, earlier we had dough that was a bit dense, but here you can see we have a bit of bubbles forming. Now comes the critical part of not overworking this. There's a temptation to start kneading this again, but the reason that we cut out 75 grams per person, or 150 grams, was precisely this. Now we used our handy wooden spoon to detach this from the bowl. And then we fold this in together. Pretending that we didn't just drop the camera, we continue as normal. And what you missed, I basically folded this 1, 2, 3, 4. Then you roll it up into a ball-shaped object thing. Grab what we referred to kindly earlier as Chekhov's rolling pin, not have it in the shot and then forget to use it. Now, I have to remember not to make a pizza, so I have to remember not to roll it out in the shape of a pizza, but rather try to keep this very square, and remember to actually only bake half at a time. That's why this was so difficult, because I'm not used to doing this on film. But we roll this out into a rectangular-ish shape. Panda will no doubt join us again, but now you can make this any, that's another good thing about this. You can make this any size, literally any size that you want. I like them on the larger side, but you can make them thinner and cut them smaller if you want. And then we take our glorious mixture here, layering it fairly evenly. This is entirely personal how you want your cinnamon rolls to taste. So this is just an example. There's really no wrong way to do this, and you have to kind of try it out a few times to see what works for you. Do you like it more buttery, which makes it a bit more crispy? Do you like it more sugary, which gives you more caramel? Or do you like it? I would recommend trying this because this is delicious. You take a green apple and you spread it on your filling, which helps to keep the whole thing moist and tasting like apples. Then roll this up. I just felt like making larger ones today, but you can make this thinner. You can cut these, you know, like this. You can cut them however shape you want. So what I feel like making today. We are at the final stage. Now the temptation is to throw these immediately in the oven, but you can
Hold the phone.
literally.
Oh, hold the phone literally. That's funny. That was way more literal than I expected, but yes.
We are at the final stage. The traditional method of doing this is you leave them for 10 to 12 minutes on the table, room temperature, yada yada yada. But if you're like me, you're going to want the fastest way possible to eat these. And the way to do that is just to pop them on the preheated oven already with one of these, using your previously wet thing. Now, we had camera issues, so I already let them rise for roughly a minute. But just leave them like this and take the thing off. Once they feel slightly like they held the shape that you put them on, they are ready to go into the oven, like I said, around 200 degrees. I have apples to compensate for the only underheat that I have. But ideally you want to make this at 200 degrees with a convection oven. Now, as I mentioned earlier, where you live and the weather influences your baking a lot. So if you're somewhere cold and dry, or somewhere warm or humid, it's gonna influence baking times, rising times, etc., etc. So what we are looking for is stages of baking, not an actual time frame. So this can take between 12 and 20 minutes, depending on how accurate your 200 degree oven is. If you have convection, if you have over, under, whatever type of different oven that you have. So this takes between 12 and 20 minutes based on the size of the cinnamon rolls you end up making and the weather and conditions above where you're baking. So we will return to this when they are basically finished. while we wait, I figured I would explain why this particular recipe is called a baker's dozen cinnamon rolls. A dozen, by the way, comes from Latin, which is duodecim, which is 2 and 10, and is called the duodecimal system, whereas the decimal system is where we count 10, 20, 30, up to 100, and so forth. I want to get into it a bit more and tell you why a dozen is 12. This comes to us from ancient Mesopotamia, which means the land between the two rivers, which are the Tigris and the Euphrates. The Euphrates being the river that Marcus Crassus crossed, as I mentioned in my last video, why the Sistine Chapel is called that. But in ancient Mesopotamia, more specifically the Sumerians and Babylonians, came up with a very clever way of counting past the 5 fingers on your hand by counting the parts between your fingers. So rather than going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And this is why a dozen is 12. It is the number of parts between your fingers. It's a very easy way to count. And then once you went up to 12, you could also count like this: 12, 24, 36, 48, 60. And this is the reason that we have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. And if you go from 60 to 120, 180, 240, 300 and 360, you have on the fingers of your hand managed to count all the individual degrees in a circle, which roughly lines up with our solar calendar year, which is 365 days. But if you keep track of roughly every 360 days, you can keep track with pretty good accuracy about the comings and goings of the seasons. And that is why a circle has 360 degrees and why minutes and seconds have 60 of each. And that is why a dozen is called a dozen. Now you can see that these have risen quite a lot and are still quite a bit pale, and using something other than my hand you can see that they are firm but not solid. So using a toothpick you can see that these are not quite ready, but they're very close. So they've now risen and taken on a new shape, but they are not quite complete. So we now have the finished product, and so as you can see they have now turned golden brown, and this is the reason that we did not put any cinnamon in the dough itself, just to show you very clearly that this is not a measure of time. This tiny golden crust here and all of them, I have very warm hands, you might burn yourself, so be careful. But this tiny crust here, the golden crust, is what we're looking for. Now when you make this the second time, feel free to put cinnamon in the dough itself. It really helps the aroma and the flavor, but this is just so you can see for the very first time how it turns from this to this, and as soon as you have this, your cinnamon rolls are ready. Now the only thing that remains is to pick out your favorite to eat for yourself. And I'm slightly partial, I quite like this one, but I think I'm gonna go for this. And I am gonna you should not do this, you should eat this properly, but I'm gonna, for the sake of scientific research, I'm gonna show you. This should be fluffy, this should be nice and tasty, and this should, now I cut this too early, you would ideally want to leave this, but I am greedy and I have been working on these for too long not to try to eat one myself. So I'm going to grab this, they should fall apart just such. Actually slightly burned my hand. And this is how they should come apart. You should have a firm golden brown bottom, and they should fall apart when you tear at them. And now the only thing is to try to not burn myself. It's pretty damn good. Now this recipe is a lot easier to do if you're, for example, not filming while you're doing it. But the key thing to remember is this: if the dough looks too wet, just keep working at it, heat it up a bit, let it stand for a few minutes and then come back to it. Resist the urge to put too much flour because the less flour you have, the more you have of this falling apart, melting in your mouth cinnamon roll, which is what we're after. So, little history lesson, history on a plate. Enjoy your baker's lesson. I will see you on the next one. Thanks for watching. So.